The biggest thing that I did to change was I started journaling because if you can't have a conversation with yourself, if you can't develop a relationship with yourself and evolve and refine what you believe about life or about yourself, if you can't express that to yourself, you're going to be challenged to express it to someone else. And through the act of journaling, and I mean, I journal just about every day now, and sometimes it's a couple pages and sometimes it's half a paragraph, but it's just that ability to communicate with myself that has deepened my ability to connect with others and my certainty of Christ's triumph over not just my life, but everyone's life.
All right, now, real quick, I want to talk to my aspiring authors here today. If you've ever said, I want to write a book, but I don't know where to start, then listen up. I'm hosting a live writing masterclass this Sunday, and this is your opportunity to stop waiting and start writing. In this session, we're going to map out your book and get crystal clear on your specific message. You're going to take the first step toward making your book a reality. So if you're ready to invest in your dream and finally take action, then head over to jorionneal.com/your_story_matters. Click the link below in the show notes, and I'll see you inside. Welcome back, family, to another episode of 30 Minutes of Power, where we don't just talk about transformation, we live it. I am your host, Jori O'Neal, and today's guest is someone whose life journey is a walking testimony of resurrection, revelation, and radical faith. From a near-death experience at the age of 6 to becoming a Marine Corps, to climbing the ranks of corporate leadership before hitting rock bottom during the pandemic, David Richards has lived many lives. It was in the pit of despair that he found his true path, and today he is on a mission to help others awaken their divine identity. David, welcome to the show, my friend.
Jory, oh, love the energy. It must be a Friday. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Listen, I want to dive in. I don't want to waste any time. This is
Let's
30
do
minutes
it.
of power.
Let's do it.
What many would call, I guess, a supernatural encounter at just 6 years old, like a hammer to the back of the head. That's an
Yeah.
out of body experience. Can you take us back to that moment and how it planted a seed that would later bloom decades later?
Yeah. I grew up in the military, so my dad was a Marine as well. So most of my life I lived on base growing up. But for 4 years, when I was in kindergarten through third grade, we lived out in town outside of the University of Maryland in a little town called Hyattsville. And it was cool because on base, life is very uniform, literally. I mean, everyone wears the same costume to work every day, kind of, and it's a very safe environment. So when we lived out in town, it was wild because my dad was the only person in the Marines, in the military on our block. And my best friend was this kid named Danny. And Danny lived up the street from me. I've got an older brother who's 3 years older than me. Danny had an older brother who was 3 years older, and then another brother who was 6 years older. So it was like that was our gang, kind of. And the thing was, Danny used to get really mad sometimes. And you could never know. And for six, you don't think it's much if you're an adult, but when you're six, like your best friend goes, we used to call him a spaz. And you never knew what was going to set Danny off. He would just sometimes go into these rages, and it would be so extreme that his brothers would have to physically restrain him until he calmed down. So one day we were out in a backyard of some stranger's house. This was the 70s, and so there wasn't any helicopter parenting. And we were just playing in someone's backyard, like I said, at a stranger's house, and there was construction in the backyard, like the back of the house was being worked on, and there was a hammer on the ground. And at one point, Danny's oldest brother, who's also named David, said, "You know what? It's time to go home for dinner." And for whatever reason, that set Danny off. He wasn't done playing for the day, and his face just went red. His eyes started bulging out of his head, and his brother started to approach him, trying to calm him down. And he must have just seen the hammer on the ground, picked it up, and everybody started to turn and run. And I remember his middle brother said, "Run!" And I remember he threw the hammer, and then it hit me square in the back of the head, and I was out. And I put the memory out of my mind until the pandemic. And then I kind of went back to that moment, and I realized, oh my gosh, I remember watching his oldest brother, David, carry my body down the street, and I was outside my body. And I saw that he was flanked by my brother and Danny and their other brother, Matt. And I was like 15 feet behind them, and it was kind of a gloomy picture, and I couldn't get back into my body. And then the next memory I had was waking up with a bandage around my head. Danny and his mom were at my house. He was apologizing. His eyes were bloodshot from crying so much. And I realized obviously at age 6, I couldn't process what a near-death experience was. But when I got to the pandemic, I realized, oh my gosh, that was kind of the beginning of my journey of faith.
Wow. So clearly we are more than just this body, and that's a whole
Yeah.
word in itself. But
Yep.
it sounds like the pandemic cracked something open
I,
for you.
yeah. So I had a weird journey through life in terms of love when it came to women. And at an early age, before the hammer incident, I had this directive that I was going to find a woman who was somehow going to connect me to God, which is a big, and when you're young, it kind of manifests in Cinderella stories or Snow White. You see that Disney cartoon, you think, oh, that kind of love is out there that exists. By the time I got to the end of 2019, I'd been married and divorced twice. I had a daughter from my first marriage, and I was leaving a 3.5 year relationship that had kind of been almost like a last hurrah. And part of it was the woman and I got along really great. We have the same musical tastes. We love sports, same sort of sarcastic sense of humor. And except she didn't believe in God. And by this point in my life, I was kind of like, that was my, like, well, I haven't considered someone who doesn't really have a spiritual belief. So let me try that approach. And I couldn't get myself to go there. And as the pandemic started, we had shared a home that she had owned, and I was kind of even though I was successful in corporate America, had a good job, and I could have gotten my own place. But I said, you know what? I'm working on my next book. I got to sort my life out. Like I've got to process the decades of the life that I haven't processed. So I was living with family, and I got into the pandemic working on my next book, and then I just had these kind of really deep spiritual experiences happen where I went to a mastermind with Jack Canfield in California the third week in March after the pandemic had shut down. And for those who don't know, Jack is a really successful author and speaker. He's sold 500 million copies of his Chicken Soup for the Soul series of books. And when I went to the mastermind, I told him my story of love and how I'd written, the last relationship I was in, I'd written a woman a poem a day for 6 months, usually 2 or 3 poems a day, because I was so intent on conquering love, whatever this thing called love was. And obviously the relationship didn't work out. And when you go to a mastermind, you're pitching someone your idea for a book or a program, and based on their experience, they're going to lend you insights and perspective. And so towards the end of the mastermind, Jack said, well, you've got a year. Like, what does that mean? Like a year? What? Okay. All right, whatever. So I'd gotten into meditation during that, and I had kind of this spiritual awakening where I experienced a meditation, and it was my judgment day. It's kind of like, this is why your life has turned out the way it has.
Hmm.
And there weren't any like images, but it was just themes. And then that was on Tuesday, March 31st of the pandemic. And then by that Saturday, I saw an image on Instagram of a woman that I knew I'd seen before. And that image changed my life because it really opened me up to faith and what really faith was. And as a writer, I started putting a causality between everything that was happening. So the pandemic, the end of my relationship, this weird encounter with Jack Canfield, this Judgment Day meditation, now seeing this beautiful woman that I knew gave me an instant sense of deja vu. And then that kind of led me to, okay, what do I really believe about Christ? And is that belief really alive in me? And that was my journey through the pandemic. So yeah, and so the hammer incident was a big part of that when I came back to that and realized, oh my gosh, I had an out of body experience when I was 6 years old.
It sounds like so, and it's interesting because I actually went to a virtual mastermind during the pandemic with Jack Canfield and James Melanchek.
Oh,
So
no kidding. That's awesome.
yeah, so that's ironic right there.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Wow.
Which actually started me on my author journey. And so
Oh,
like
beautiful.
yeah, so definitely a lot of love for Jack. Jack Canfield, shout out to you, brother. I'm thinking because my father would often say he's also ex-military. He always says like a life unexamined is not worth living.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the pandemic gave you this opportunity. I think for a lot of us, it gave us an opportunity to examine like what's important, what's true, what do we value, what don't we value, what have we almost like subscribed to subconsciously, and what do we like intentionally live out day to day, right? We
Yeah.
say, I love God, I'm a Christian, I'm this, I'm that. What does your life actually say? And I think there were a lot of us who came kind of to that fork in the road. We're like, all right, well, if I say I'm about it, then I actually have to be about it. So you mentioned in the book something that you said King David, one of the most
Yeah,
beloved figures of the Bible.
yeah.
You said that he doesn't ascend to heaven. And recently I also I heard I'm doing the Bible in a year with
Oh, nice.
pastor or reverend or father I don't know what his title is, but he is going through the Bible and sharing how our relationship with God is not linear. Like if you do these things, you don't get this result. And so I'm interested to learn like where did that direction come from? You say that King David, one of the Bible's most beloved figures, doesn't ascend to
Yeah,
heaven. And why
yeah.
why is that revelation so crucial, I think, for us today, in your opinion?
Yeah, what a great question. So, and this is what's wild about this is I didn't even discover this until the last, I'd say 2 years. And it was, I wrote, so just for context, during the pandemic, when I saw this picture, I was of this woman, I was working on my third book and it was going to go in a different direction. And it was kind of about some of what you said, right? We live in an age of distraction, right? Where everyone is vying for your attention. And the more outrageous a headline, the more outrageous a post, the more the belief is you're going to get likes and followers. And I thought, well, that's a really extreme, that's kind of putting what you're doing before who you are. And it's really important to focus on who you are. And that was going to kind of be the gist of my book.
Hmm.
And when I saw this image, that it set me down this spiral. And it really was one of the things I've come to discover over the past couple of years in reading psychology, like reading Carl Jung and reading philosophy like Nietzsche. Carl Jung said the purpose of religion is to prevent people from having religious experiences. And what that means is, I sometimes think that people often mistake an understanding of scripture or an adherence to dogma for the spiritual journey of bearing your cross and like really saying, okay, how do I embody what my belief is? And when you really understand what belief is, it means cutting off all other possibility. I was speaking to someone earlier this week who is an atheist, and we did a 2 hour podcast. It was really intellectual and really well thought out. And part of what I said to him is, it's we don't want to just sit on scripture and say, well, I can recite the Bible from soup to nuts, from Genesis to Revelation, and I've got it. No, that's not what it's about. It's about picking up your cross and taking this journey. As the pandemic unfolded for me, it was this discovery of what is King David's relationship to Jesus. And it is a very defined and spelled out relationship. There is a covenant made to David that says, your throne will be established forever, and you will be in an everlasting kingdom that your offspring establishes. And that binds King David to Jesus. And it's really beautiful because then what happens is David obviously sleeps with Bathsheba and has her husband Uriah killed. And now there's this, well, you broke the covenant and your house is going to live and die by the sword now. And oftentimes I think, at least for me, I didn't understand the consequence of that breaking of the covenant. I think we look at David's life in the Old Testament and see the immediacy of that with Absalom, with what happens with his sister or his daughter, and kind of the fourfold curse that he brings upon himself. But when you step back and then look at the broader context of what his relationship is to Jesus, and there are numerous references in the New Testament to Jesus being the son of David. And it's not until the book of Acts that we find out David does not ascend to heaven. And you think about, well, that's kind of a plot twist. Like that seems like it's a little bit of a big deal if the king to whom an everlasting kingdom is promised through his offspring doesn't ascend to heaven. What are the consequences of that on Christianity as it advances post-resurrection period? And there's a really interesting piece of this that there is a Bible verse that is repeated 3 times throughout the Bible. First, it's in the Psalms. Then Jesus brings it up when he talks to the Pharisees. And then it's brought up in the book of Acts. And it's the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And that is David speaking under the spirit of the Lord, the big Lord, to the Messiah, saying, you will sit at my right hand. I'm going to the earth, which is the footstool, to make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And so if David doesn't ascend to heaven, is his spirit or is his soul the vanguard at which Christianity advances through the really Western civilization. So that's kind of, I can't say that I discovered all that in my third book, Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, but that's what I write about in my next book, which is coming out in a couple months. That's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack, but here, this is my superpower, right? I like to
Yeah.
take a lot of things that I hear,
Yep.
and I like to condense them into very small, bite-sized pieces, which is
Awesome.
why this podcast is only 30 minutes.
That is power.
And so from what I understand, you're saying the relationship that David has with Jesus doesn't negate him from the consequence of his actions.
No, if anything, I would say it exacerbates them because when
Mm,
you read the Psalms, people are familiar with the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, these kind of beautiful poems that David writes. But he also prophesies Jesus' death by crucifixion,
mm-hmm,
his betrayal by Judas.
mm-hmm.
So, in some ways, more so than any other prophet of the Old Testament, David is responsible for putting Jesus on the cross because Jesus must fulfill what's written about him by the Psalms, by the prophets, by the law. Additionally, in the Psalms, David says, I am greatly afflicted. I am a worm and not a man. And most tellingly, he says, everyone is a liar. So when you see what he's doing is the consequence of dividing his house against him isn't just in the context of his life as the king of Israel. It is the eternal consequence of how do you validate the supremacy of the Messiah as Christ as the Messiah. And to really understand that, you have to go beyond just the bounds of Christianity to look at Islam, because they believe Jesus is the Messiah to the Jewish people, and to Judaism, because they believe the Messiah comes from the house of David. Well, if that's true, there must be a conscious reconciliation between King David and Jesus. You don't necessarily see that a lot in the biblical text in terms of the father-son relationship. There's obviously the story of Jonah and the whale. But if you look into fiction, there is a much more prevalent understanding of that nature of that relationship, whether it's Pinocchio rescuing his father Geppetto, or probably more recently and more relevantly for most people, it's Luke Skywalker rescuing his father Darth Vader. And there's this theme throughout our mythology and storytelling of the son rescuing his father from the dark cave. So my contention in writing the book is Jesus kind of has to rescue King David from the pit, which is why there are so many Psalms that David writes about being saved from the pit, because David's consequence of breaking the covenant for this everlasting kingdom necessitates Christ saves not only everyone who's a liar, but certainly King David himself.
So Christ's sacrifice is not just for us, it's for those who came before him as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm,
In
so
order to perpetuate in order to fulfill the Davidic covenant, it has to be, right? There has to be an accountability between David and Christ, because if there's a messianic, if for Christ to be Messiah, it's not just a religious connotation for Christianity, it
yes.
is a historical universal implication for our species.
So you're then like coupling this because Jesus and God, right? One, Father and Son,
Yep.
because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Christ's sacrifice applies yesterday,
Yes.
thousands of years ago, today, and forever.
Well, and you see that in the book of Genesis, right? So even
Mm,
when Eve takes the bite of the apple and Adam
mm.
sins, the first thing that comes out of God's mouth is, I will create enmity between your offspring, speaking to the serpent, and her offspring. And he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. So, what is God saying there? God is actually saying that Eve has a connection to Jesus, because he is saying your offspring and her offspring, and he will crush your head, meaning the serpent. So, what you realize, and I had
That's
this,
repeated in the New Testament.
yeah, and I just had this discussion with someone a while back. Then the fall was preordained. The
Mm.
fall from the Garden of Eden is preordained, because if you think about it, there can't be redemption without the fall. There can't be the incarnation of God through Jesus Christ without the fall. So the necessity of the fall is an evolutionary consequence for our species to advance and return to the kingdom. I mean, that's really what the basis of my next book is. Love Letters to the Virgin Mary is much more kind of a firsthand account of what I believe is, I'll put it to put it more in context. About 20 years ago, a fictional series of books came out called Left Behind, and it was a 12 series
I
book.
read those.
Yeah, the 12 part story about the rapture, and everybody else has to deal with the Antichrist. And in the last book, King David is resurrected and comes to bring peace, and then the unification of heaven and earth takes place. And that's kind of a love letters to the Virgin Mary. The resurrection of King David is a firsthand account of what that would be like from King David's perspective of being raised from the dead in the modern world. And it kind of ties into the pandemic as sort of a playing out of the book of Revelation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one thing that I definitely wanted to touch on
Sure.
before you go. You speak of oneness, like right, this idea of Christ consciousness.
Yeah.
So some folks hear that and they may get uncomfortable with that idea of Christ consciousness because when we think of consciousness, we think of new age, we think of spirituality, right? And so they don't really put those two together. So can you
Yeah.
unpack that in a way that deepens rather than disrupts people of
Absolutely.
traditional faith?
Yeah. So 1 Corinthians 2:16, we all share the mind of Christ. So if we all share the mind of Christ, that means we have access to that consciousness of Christ, right? I mean, if I'm not sure how else you could interpret that saying. If we all share the mind of Christ, then let's look at it from a somewhat more philosophical perspective. But if we conceive of, if I look at um, Yahweh or Hashem, Jesus or Allah, of the three monotheistic faiths, what is the highest conceivable good? Well, I know it's not Allah because Allah does not love non-believers. And Jesus teaches people to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So, notch to Jesus. Hashem or Yahweh is, I don't know that there's a stance that it takes in terms of being God. So it still again points to Jesus. And if no one comes to the Father except through Christ, then it's not, salvation's not external. Salvation is internal. Faith is an inside job. So if we all share the mind of Christ, the question then becomes, how conscious are you to that mind within you?
Hmm.
And do you see, if Jesus is the light of the world, when he says, I am the light of the world, are you seeing that light universally? Or are you seeing it conditionally? Because if you're just seeing it conditionally based on, well, that person believes what I believe, so I believe they're saved, or whatever the connotation is, and that person, oh, they're a Muslim or they're Hindu, therefore I don't believe that Christ's consciousness is somehow responsible for them. To me, what that says is Christ's existence is conditional. And
Hmm.
I believe Christ's condition existence is universal, which means I see his light ubiquitously throughout the world. And that to me is how I explain the Christ consciousness in the context of 1 Corinthians 2 through 16, 2:16.
I love that. I think for a lot of people, that idea of the love of God equaling the acceptance of Christ, not that he accepts all our behaviors, as seen absolutely in the response of God toward David in his
Right.
sin,
Right.
but the love of God and the acceptance of Christ means that if I have the mind of Christ, then I should love everyone. I should be able to see the God, the Christ in everyone.
Right. And I mean, and Matthew 5:14, Jesus says, those who love me will obey my teachings. My Father will love them. We will come to them and make our home in them. So, I mean, think about that, because I grew up on a church and a belief system that God was outside of me. And to hear Jesus say, no, we will come and make our home inside you. Well, what does that mean? Like what does that mean besides our divine origin, our divine, I mean, that is a part of our inherent nature, and it's through the authenticity and validation of Christ's consciousness as the supreme highest conceivable good that we validate and bring that inside of us and bring it to life inside of us. To me, that is, I mean, that was, as I've kind of deepened my own spiritual practice and journey, that has been revolutionary to me, because the whole idea, especially in the Old Testament, the theme of the Old Testament is really separation. It's God's separation from humanity. We're not
Yeah.
ready for divine direct connection. And then Jesus closes the gap because now God is incarnate in a human being in physical form. And that's why we're meant to embody what Jesus teaches, which is why he says, pick up your cross and follow me. Because to really understand the greatest test of faith is, do I, or how do I consciously apprehend that Christ has triumphed over death and that his promise of everlasting life is something that I can consciously realize in my being? Regardless of what my physical form is, regardless of how old I am, what does it take for me to embody the conviction that Christ has already triumphed over death?
So you're talking about divine alignment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love that. Listen, Dave, listen, if someone listening right now
Yeah.
and they are feeling stuck, they're stuck in their job, they're stuck in their faith, they're stuck in their relationship, what's the first step toward breakthrough?
It's what a beautiful question. For me, so I tried at 11 years to write a horror story because I wanted to be like the next Stephen King. And in 2016, 2017, I started reading Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, which is kind of the Bible of the law of attraction. But if you read the book, it's based on Christianity. It's based on the fact that there is this infinite intelligence that in the West we call Christianity. And I switched gears and I wrote my first book in 2017. The biggest thing that I did to change was I started journaling. I started journaling because if you can't have a conversation with yourself, if you can't develop a relationship with yourself and evolve and refine what you believe about life or about yourself, if you can't express that to yourself, you're going to be challenged to express it to someone else. And through the act of journaling, and I mean, I journal just about every day now, and sometimes it's a couple pages and sometimes it's half a paragraph, but it's just that ability to communicate with myself that has deepened my ability to connect with others and my certainty of Christ's triumph over not just my life, but everyone's life.
I love that. Listen, Dave, this has been more than a conversation. All right. This has been confirmation for me that I am on the right path. So I
Yes.
appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
Where can
you.
folks connect with you, get your books, follow your journey? Please share with us. How can we get more of this delicious conversation?
Jori, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. This is 30 Minutes of Power for sure. David Richards Author is my website, so my books are there. If you want to book me to speak, I'd certainly suggest that you read my books first so you can understand what I'm going to speak about. I'm also on Instagram at David Richards Author.
Awesome. So again, folks, Love Letters to the Virgin Mary is out now, and Becoming One with Christ drops this spring 2025. Is this accurate, David?
It is May 29th. The book's going to drop.
Woo! All right, y'all heard it here. Power doesn't come from a title or a platform. It comes from alignment with the divine.
Amen.
Thank you, David, for sharing your journey and igniting something in us today for sure. This is Jori O'Neal. This has been 30 Minutes of Power. Stay bold, stay faithful, and remember, power is not just what you do, it is who you become. Till next time, people. Peace. All right, before we wrap up today, I want to remind you, if a book is on your heart, then this Sunday is your chance to finally take that first step. Join me for a live writing masterclass, and we'll break down the book writing process and get you moving forward from idea to execution. So head over to jorioneal.com/your_story_matters. Thanks for tuning in to 30 Minutes of Power. We hope today's episode inspired you to take action and make a positive change in your life. Remember, your power is meant to empower others. So share this episode with someone who needs encouragement today. We'd love to hear from you. So connect with us on Instagram at 30 Minutes of Power or email us at azironsharpensiron@gmail.com. Until next time, stay empowered and keep empowering others.
30 minutes of power.